So, hi, I'm Zoe Reiter. I'm the representative to the US International. I'm just very curious, how many of you have been to one of these democracy the democracy dialogues have been around since last year when civil society came together and realized that there may be actual lessons learned out there in the world that we can take on board to tackling threats. American with, professionalism notwithstanding, there are insights to be gained as well for our partners abroad from folks here. So I'm actually personally very delighted that these two are sitting together right now. To my left, we have Eduardo Bohórquez, who is the head of the GI's chapter in Mexico and a longtime co-conspirator of mine. I've been at TI for 10 years, been there a little longer. Juliana, marching orders, and just really excited for him to tell his experience about the face-to-face campaign, which I think has a lot to say for folks here who are thinking about similar pledge campaigns. And then Leslie Burke, who I'm so happy to meet finally in person, at Trailblazers, and has done a tremendous amount of work with great impact. She will be shortly. Online we have, where is Balazs? Yeah, Balazs Jarabik, who he has a long title, but he's basically one of those fancy scholars at Carnegie, not living in DC, but actually working on corruption in the Ukraine, and who has also done an incredibly insightful, useful assessment for Open Society on the impact, challenges, and opportunities tied to something called Reconstruction of the state in the Czech Republic. We'll tell you more about that. But that is very much a coalition-led initiative started by some actually environmental civil society organizations who wanted to partner with the more technical civil society organizations like the Czech Republic to lead reform by really creating greater pressure on candidates to commit to a set of anti-corruption pledges and then goes forward to a legislative platform. What we're going to do today is have a very quick sort of introduction by the panelists, sort of the initiatives themselves, what worked well, what are the challenges, lessons learned to take forward for folks who are thinking about replicating this kind of work both here and abroad. And I just want to, before we get started, I just want to open with a quote. I lifted this off of Balazs's report, but it's a quote from anti-corruption activists you and I know very well, talking about how corruption is changing its form. Influential groups no longer need to break the law. They instead push through legal changes and maintain a false sense of legality, which causes frustration among the public. That actually was the head of our Czech Republic. And I think most of you listening probably thought that could easily be an American who's working in the space where so much of what Guy calls corruption, the abuse of entrusted powers for private gain, is actually legal, right? Americans' understanding of corruption is probably not a decipherable thing, but I think it's safe to say that the calls to drain the swamp, unrig the system, registered strong dissatisfaction with the status quo, one where there is common shared analysis that we have significant challenges of policy and regulatory capture by corporate and special interests. I see that Scott Reiter is in the room. I'm very happy to see you. Hopefully we can actually hear from him a bit about Represent Us's great work at the state level as well. Since it's a smaller crowd, we're going to make this more of a conversation. So with no further ado, I'd like to ask one who's, I think it's now 2 a.m, his time, Balazs, to quickly share with you the work of the reconstruction of the state.
Yeah, hi everyone.
There it is.
Can you hear me, right? All is fine with the connection. Great.
Yeah, let me just get him on the...
Wait. So my co-conspirator here has reminded me that I completely forgot her presentation. Nat is actually the director of the Open Gov Hub and is the real force behind all of this work. So I probably want to give her her chance to do her presentation, which is a very quick and dirty overview of some of these kinds of pledge campaigns here in the United States.
And then we'll turn over to Balazs. Thank you. Yeah, good afternoon or good evening, everyone. I wasn't gunning for a compliment, but I do want to just quickly kind of set the stage here with a super quick snapshot of research we did on how pledges around the influence of money in politics have played out just in the last few weeks with the midterm elections here in the US to kind of set the stage. And then we'll jump right in to hear from the panelists. So the first thing to kind of note is that that there's really a large amount of support from the American public, right, in seeing a change with regards to the influence of politics in this country. And so I've included, a few statistics here from some recent polls, including one done in September, just looking at how much a significant portion of this population really sees the influence of special interests through money in politics as a real issue in this country. And so here's just a very quick snapshot of a few ways that we saw people trying to address this problem in the midterm elections this year. So the first type of initiative, which there are several amazing examples of, are what we can call these people packs or people's packs. Trailblazers being a fantastic example of really citizen-led and grassroots initiatives to make sure that candidates are really fundraising from their constituents instead of from these corporate or other forms of special interest. So here's, by no means comprehensive, but just a quick snapshot of what are some of these organizations, many of whom which have just cropped up in the last 2 years, who are really trying to set a new norm, right, and kind of put a stake in the ground and support candidates who are pushing back against that trend and really, raise fundraising from their constituents and being open about where their resources come from. Yeah, again, just a list of some organizations involved in this, and we'll be hearing more from Trailblazers shortly. Another way in which this played out is with regards to a number of ballot initiatives, right? So these are great examples of how people are trying to actually change the legislation and the laws around disclosure and campaign finance. I'm especially interested to hear more from Eduardo and Balazs about how you see, the top-down and bottom-up initiatives in your country playing out differently. But there was a number of state-level ballot initiatives that were introduced in 2018, a good number of which passed, that have something to do with adopting stricter rules around campaign financing. Yeah, again, just a few mentioned here, from the Clean Missouri legislation to Question 2 in the state of Massachusetts, and some other initiatives. It's also helpful to note that some of these, they take different approaches to the problem. Some ballot initiatives, like in Massachusetts, set up a new citizen commission to help determine what campaign finance reform is needed in that state. Whereas in Florida, the reform that was passed specifically prohibited public officials from lobbying, while they're in office and 6 years after they leave office. So lots of different ways to tackle, the same big problem that we're here to talk about. And finally, this really played out at a whole new scale in 2018 with a huge number of candidates, right, themselves proactively committing not to take money from corporate PACs and really using that as a way to differentiate themselves. So, excuse me. So the number of no PAC money pledges really skyrocketed during this recent midterm elections, with more than 100 congressional candidates making these pledges. And, some of whom are very prominent and well known, that many of you know names you'll recognize here, from Beto O'Rourke to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And while it's true that there was a number of these candidates on the Democratic side, it wasn't exclusively that case. So we can also talk more about how these things play out. But at the end of the day, again, there was really a huge uptick in candidates, as well as ballot initiatives, as well as citizen-led efforts, all to really limit the influence of money in politics. And so, we're really here today to learn from other countries' experiences and the kind of new momentum here on the ground in the US to tackle this topic. So I will stop there, and I'll get Balazs on the screen. I'll just hand over to Balazs. Do you want to introduce yourself and just give a quick overview of the initiative you're here to educate us about today?
Yes, hi everyone. My name is Balazs Jarabik. I'm a Hungarian from Slovakia and working for the Carnegie Endowment as a non-resident scholar, and also doing all kind of things in Central and Eastern Europe, mostly with civil society organizations. I have over 20 years of experience working with exactly this sector. Anti-corruption, I have to confess, is not my major focus, never actually been, but that's why I can evaluate, right? So I have a fresh eyes, I coming in and I can say, oh guys, what did you do here and there? No, seriously, I mean, I have been obviously coming from Central Europe myself. I was born there in Czechoslovakia, actually. So I thought that, like as an object or a subject of these policies can also provide a few things. And I have 12 points to share about a very interesting coalition, which was called the Reconstruction of the State. It was a civil society coalition in the Czech Republic. It was the first time, I would say, when the NGOs, lawyers particularly, it was mostly a legal initiatives. And lawyers started it, and they said, enough of the politicians because they're all corrupt, and it's time that the technocrats are coming from, the grassroots level. Interestingly, it was very heavily regional impacted. They're coming from the region, this entire initiative, not from the capital itself. So, like what the technocrats can do to deal with what they called the cartel of insiders, like this is how they call the political parties. So they actually, what they did, and it was they developed 9 legislative pieces, 9 laws, and offered that to the political parties as a pledge. The first time was the pledge campaign was used in the Czech Republic. And it was very successful for one particular reason, simply because the government coalition collapsed after they started. They didn't impact that. It was a scandal, which essentially was a very characteristic scandal, because imagine that the chief of staff of the prime minister, a female chief of staff who is a mistress of the prime minister, ordered the secret services to surveil the wife of the prime minister. And it all came out, and the government collapsed over this scandal. And this is the initiative, the timing of the initiative where it's coming in. And so everybody wants to do something, and all the politicians are actually pledging. So they're coming with the 9 initiatives, and like they have been very original, excellent timing, but also become very controversial actor for various reasons, as the results are going to show. So I already mentioned the impact. I mentioned the timing and the tactic, the peer and the media pressure. And the result was that the majority of the legislative pieces has been passed by the parliament, namely 5 out of 9, including the law on financing of the political parties, which actually established a new independent oversight body over campaign financing. Also the law on conflict interest. And what has been considered the biggest success is the law on public register of contracts. So essentially, it's almost all the government contracts has been transparent and put outside, in a transparent website. What actually the context, like what has been the consequences of all this? Well, first of all, when we were doing this, we have been collecting a wide range of empirical data. And it was a very interesting phenomenon, which is not only valid for the Czech Republic, for the entire Central and Eastern European region, particularly Central Europe, the new members of the European Union. So you see a very high level of perception, over 80 or close to 90%. Essentially, the public thinks everybody is corrupt. At the same time, and this is quite high. The trends are showing that this is not going down too much. And there you have the corruption experience, and that has been significantly down from like 20-25% to 4%. And then you're asking yourself, what is the gap? What's like a huge gap, right? So essentially our conclusion was that there was a combination of factors, a very loud anti-corruption campaign, the law enforcement and political party efforts. There was a confused perception of corruption, and that's also distorted the fight against the corruption. So that was point number 4. Point number 5, the side effect. One of the side effects of all these legislations, there was a lot of steps, bureaucratic steps to the government, checks, internal controls, and all this to build in based on this anti-corruption legislation. One of the side effects was that it has really affected the average people and the state institutions. But the high level, the rent seekers, remained largely unchecked. You know, the big companies, like for example, if you were going for a public tender, right, then you have to do a lot of compliance. Small and medium companies, as well as organizations, NGOs, were the ones who were suffering. The big companies, they were actually do the compliance very easily because they have the capacity. They were actually helped by this legislation. So you see the distortion essentially favoring this legislation was heavily favoring the bigger companies. The bigger, the better, the easier to do the compliance. So that was the cost of policies. And our findings, point number 6, was that, you know, like the coalition did have obviously a large impact on how the public perceives corruption. But, you know, we say based on number of data that this perception of corruption is over-embellished. And what the Czech Republic, as well as the entire region, faces is more incompetence. So it's a competence versus corruption. And a lot of things which is simply competence. For example, if you ask an ordinary Czech, what is the biggest problem, which certainly must be corruption-based, they're going to say building of the highway. There is a highway between the two big Czech cities, which the Germans built under Hitler, right? I mean, how come, like, there must be corruption? Essentially, it's incompetence. Plus the anti-corruption, you know, check and balances and all this are not helping procurement to do in terms of the big things. So the scandals, the actual corruption campaigns are very much have their impact here. And point number 7, so the coalition, according to our findings, I mean, the reconstruction of the state also contributed to paralyzing the state. And it's not, you know, like when I'm saying this, the contribution was minor compared to the past 20 years of, you know, morphing into a cartel of insiders, the entire post-communist traditional, as I call the traditional post-communist political party system. But at the same time, it collapsed. And also that was the kind of the last probably addition to the collapse. But the vehement fight against the corruption also contributed to the creation of the hype atmosphere that makes the meaningful fight, or made the meaningful fight against corruption, not too possible. So the result is that after all this effort, actually the country's second biggest oligarch came into the power. Andrej Babiš, who is now the prime minister with the help of the president. And I do not want to say that this is, you know, this was the direct result, but these efforts, you know, unfortunately contributed to that as well, creating the atmosphere where Babiš came, the oligarch came into the power with a very simple message, which actually resonated with a lot of people. I can manage the state better. And I'm sure it's resonated with the Americans. So I'm a big, you know, I'm an owner of big companies. I can manage companies, therefore I can manage the state. And here comes the problem with the traditional parties, that they actually managed to bring down in the past 20 years, you know, the state has been, you know, the big campaign for the markets, as well as the state, you know, the smaller the state, the better, and the markets are actually no better. It has been a big effect in Central and Eastern Europe. Point number 9, formalized fight. It was, you know, like the coalition that drafted these 9 laws, and they clanked into these 9 laws, then nothing would happen. And there were not enough analysis, impact analysis, as well as flexibility in the coalition to say, okay, this is working, this is not working. So we're, instead of driving the entire agenda forward, they were actually climbing into this, and they were not able to change things where they would be necessary to do. Also, there have been kind of waging a campaign which, you know, came with the accusations like, if you didn't sign up for this, you were immediately labeled as a corrupt or supporting corruption, which has been obviously, it's like a boomerang came back because it was a very partisan, polarized way of campaigning and not inclusive on the convincing side. So as a result, point number 10, it opened the way to an oligarch who is still ruling the country without actually a clear majority, simply because A, has a media, it has all the elements, it has the political support for the president, and he can buy influence among the people as well as he can buy the necessary support in the parliament if they want. It still doesn't mean that, you know, everything is bad in Czech Republic, but certainly Babiš, under Babiš, the prime minister was able to utilize the anti-corruption campaign. He actually was standing behind it immediately. He was the first to sign up the entire new party, you know, and cling into the managing state result as much as possible. So where we are here, and there are the last 2 points. The Czech Republic has enough check and balances. You know, there is the government is, you know, there's a two-chamber parliament, and there is a Senate, which there was only Senate elections a few months ago, and they were heavily anti-Babiš Senate, actually on a constitutional majority in the Senate against the government. You know, it's still the government as well as the lowing chambers, the main decision-maker body, but still there's a very strong check and balances, as well as still, because of these laws and because of these legislative work, there is a strong, particularly law enforcement bodies who are quite independent, despite of the political nominees. And, you know, you see in particular the police, there are, you know, they're professionals working in the law enforcement agencies, and you see clashes between the political interest as well as the so-called the technocrats or the institutional interest of the current political situation. My last point is the conflict of interest. And, you know, one of the things is, and it was already mentioned that, you know, with the oligarch, with the big companies coming in, and this has been not a Czech phenomenon. The same is happening in Hungary. The same is happening in Slovakia. And this is a reaction, a local reaction on what is happening in the global scale. You know, people are saying, oh, Babiš is a smart guy because he were able to build up this big company and he can compete with the big multinationals. So he's our Czech. By the way, he's from Slovakia, which is even makes it more interesting that a Slovak oligarch actually ruling the Czech Republic now or managing the Czech state. So, you know, like, so the people, particularly in the rural and the regional, in the regions, in the rural area, are kind of, you know, clinging into him, like saying, this is the guy who can represent our interest vis-a-vis the global interest. So it's a kind of a local anti-revolution against those. But there is also a new phenomenon, this conflict of interest, which doesn't require necessarily to break the law. The Reiter assumed to shape it. So, you know, like, and the conflict of interest and the primary concept within these new forms of extraditing the state resources within the law. Hungary is also a prime example. When the Hungarians do something, they're actually doing it with the constitutional majority in the parliament. They're always making sure that there is a legal backing, even by big corruption deals. The Czech Republic doesn't have that, but they still, these big companies, they have the best lawyers, they can afford the best lawyers, and therefore, you know, the new phenomenon is essentially how to fight the conflict of interest, which does not necessarily look or breaking the law, and that doesn't look legal. I mean, doesn't look illegal. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Balazs. The run of show today is basically that each panelist, 5 to 7 minutes, do a quick and dirty description of the campaign, is what the impact has been, maybe allude to challenges. Then we'll do a round of discussion, Q&A with me, just to follow up and some core ideas that I really want to ask. Make sure we have built. So next I'm going to ask Eduardo Bohórquez, face to face.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Zoe, for the kind invitation. Loud. It's loud. It's okay. When I have the opportunity of addressing a group of talented professionals working on this area of governance and democratic change, I think, yes, for that one maybe. Yeah. Sorry about that. When I have the opportunity of talking to professionals of this area, democratic governance, anti-corruption, security, I normally say that the two biggest problems for our democracies are not corruption and impunity, but cognitive dependence paths and institutional dependence paths. We have a lot of trouble understanding what we are addressing, and we have a lot of preconceptions because almost everyone in the planet has at least once the opportunity of participating in a corrupt exchange, thinking they are anti-corruption experts. But those are two different disciplines. So corruption and anti-corruption are entirely different disciplines. And because we're talking a lot of reform, policy reform, institutional change, we tend to think that we know where institutions should be directed to and how we can change those institutions. But those are also two very different things too. One thing is assessing the level of institutional quality of something, and a totally different is how to reform it and how to make change. The story I'm going to tell in hopefully 5 minutes, you simply make me know when those are gone. It's about how a very broad coalition of entrepreneurs, business sector, academics, and civil society gathered together to do simultaneously two things in Mexico. Mobilize public opinion and civil society citizens in general, and at the same time provide constitutional and legal reform to create a new anti-corruption system. So there is a very limited number of people in Mexico that understand that these are two chronologies happening in parallel terms at the same time. And it obviously challenges the spectator approach, no? Because if you focus a lot on tres de tres is 3 out of 3, which basically means a public invitation to disclose voluntarily and now mandatorily your asset declaration, if you're a politician or a candidate or an elected member of Congress, your asset declaration, your interest declaration, how do you call it in English? The registry of interest, and your tax declaration. So in order to fulfill the commitment, you have to do the 3 things at the same time. But that was a popular approach to the issue. At the same time, we were reforming the Constitution, the Mexican Constitution, which is not an easy task. We are a federation, so you have to reform it at the federal level first and then go to 17 congresses in the country to do the same. We were reforming 7 laws, one that created a new anti-corruption system. It's around 440 different articles. We changed the criminal code, we created a new special attorney general for anti-corruption and a whole set of things. But basically we created a coordination scheme that makes sense in terms of policy, because we have every single institution that is required, an internal auditor, an external auditor, a special prosecutor for administrative crimes, a special prosecutor for criminal cases, the financial intelligence unit, but they make no sense as a whole, as a policy. And the other issue that we were trying to make simultaneously is to make citizens engage in policy change without compromising the quality or the technical approach of the issue. So I'm going to run it very fastly. Basically, what we did is in 2015, before a midterm election in Mexico, we invited senators and congresspeople to voluntarily disclose this information. Tres de Tres is right now a political science concept in Mexico, and I think it's growing in the region. No? But I'm going to refer to Tres de Tres, and I'm sorry because it sounds better in Spanish. I love it. It's because it has a lot to do with our Catholic tradition. There is a reason for creating this. No, it's the Trinity, and 3 is also a very important number for the Hispanic tradition, and it's also a triangle, which means integrity. So that, and you can understand that it's a system, not that each one of these pieces have to come together. So I'm going to refer to Tres de Tres, and I'm sorry because I'm saying it in Spanish. What Tres de Tres tried is to first voluntarily involve those in Congress, already in Congress, to voluntarily disclose this information. We were extremely unlucky. Only 5 out of 628 Congress people in Mexico accepted the challenge. No? But that was exactly what we were expecting. But these guys, they had zero incentives to take part in these initiatives. I was telling Zoe in our way to here that we were extremely happy because when former President Madero called for a revolution in 1910, 4 people attended his call, and we had 5 Congress people, so we have 25% more engagement than President Madero in 1910. When we did this, we were trying to do a very simple trick in terms of communication, strategic communication to the public. What we wanted was to create the idea that when you see 2 politicians, regardless of the political party they are associated, you think normally, I don't know, probably it's the case in the US, but in Latin America, we'll say all of them are the same. Politicians are all the same. Now we created a distinctive way of understanding if they were voluntarily putting themselves, not their party, not their government, themselves in a position to be assessed by the public by disclosing this information. And because of the nature of the information, it has to match. If you say you pay taxes and it doesn't match to your income and your income doesn't match to your properties, then you have a problem. So you need to make this consistent as a system. That's why a triangle was so relevant. Because they didn't accept it, we went for the candidates. And the candidates had a different incentive to these issues because they wanted to enter Congress. So I can tell you and summarize that since 2015, no single governor has been elected in Mexico without having to disclose voluntarily, that is an oxymoron, but having to disclose voluntarily their Tres de Tres declaration. No single governor, no single presidential candidate. We just passed a presidential election a couple of months ago, and we have a new president. No single candidate was able to run for president's office without disclosing that information. But the most exciting part is not only that politicians got engaged, because of the political atmosphere that we created. We were able also to have a broader coalition in terms of civil society that included the first ever constitutional and legal reform in the country that started from citizens' initiative. Normally, citizens' initiatives are presented, but they are not discussed by Congress. They have very good parliamentarian tricks not to say, well, it's great, it's fantastic, you address a committee, and then you can spend your whole life having meetings with Congress people and workshops and seminars and conferences. So this is the first time ever in Mexico that a citizens' initiative, you require 108,000 signatures to start a citizens' initiative. We were able to raise 643,000 signatures in 6 weeks. So this is the first time ever that a people's initiative goes to Congress, is discussed, is approved, is enacted. It was vetoed by the president. Then it became again constitutionally legal. It went to the Supreme Court, and it was declared constitutional. So it passed every single aspect of our democratic regime. Every single procedure was tested through this model. So what is relevant for us is that all these people, 634,000, they obviously knew Not that what you normally do in Latin America and Eastern Europe when you're fed up with corruption is that you go to the public square. And they understood that it was much more important to go to Congress than to go to the streets. So it was a major transformation in terms of this cognitive dependence back. Normally, what we have done historically, going to the streets like in Rio or Sao Paulo or maybe, I don't know, DC, Hungary, Ukraine, not going to the streets and shout very loudly. We went to Congress. We spent 4 months in Congress negotiating with Senate each one of the 440 articles with something that we call, because there is no precedent, we call it Open Parliament. And it was because of you, of course, the Open Gov Hub. You were the reason, you don't know it, but for the reason. So we did something called Open Parliament, which basically means that every single discussion and negotiation was broadcasted through the Mexican version of C-SPAN. No? We were having, every day we had a meeting, we had a negotiation, it was a formal procedure, and we did something that was very relevant for the public. The public invested one time in signing the initiative, but the return in terms of investment was fantastic because these guys invested a minute, they got their initiative passed, plus over 6 laws, plus a constitutional reform, and a new anti-corruption system. So it made a lot of sense to invest a minute of your time signing. Now, in 2019, for the first time, and I'm finishing it, for the first time in our history, this is the symbolic part, it's not the more relevant institutional part of it. There's a new anti-corruption system, a new committee, a lot of stuff that is relevant for people like me, but not for the general people. 3 million public servants and everyone in the judiciary in Congress are gonna mandatorily disclose their asset declaration, their registry of interest. And taxes is a different ball game because there is a secret for taxes, but they can voluntarily do so. The secret is global, it's not something Mexican, the global secret. We're still trying to find out how we're gonna do this in terms of public information. But on the other side, we created a set of 7 databases for the national anti-corruption system that will conduct via interoperability of the databases, the matches and the connections and the review of the data with the tax authorities. No? So we secure that information is going to be used, even if it's not public in terms of the tax declaration. The most interesting thing to me is that I'm a political scientist, I'm finishing, this is my conclusion. I worked a lot on Ronald Inglehert's World Value Survey discussion 25 years ago. I was responsible of doing the national political culture survey in Mexico. We did the Mexican values survey. We did the Latinobarometro. We did I was part of the discussion about 30 years of the civic culture of Gabriel Almond and Citi Verba. And every single survey I reviewed had the same conclusion.